problem of science literacy and better science communication in two different ways. And they're both really important, and it is, of course, directly relevant to our topic today, which is the reproducibility crisis in science publication, and how do we handle that as science communicators. And we have an absolutely amazing group of three people to talk us through this. And Ivan will formally introduce them, but I just want to thank John Ioannidis and Richard Harris, who are absolute authorities on this, as is, of course, our special guest moderator today, Dr. Ivan Oransky, who is a distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute and is also a senior, what's your title now, Ivan, these days?
Editor-at-large.
He's the editor-at-large of MedPage Today, and of direct relevance to our topic tonight. He is also the co-founder of Retraction Watch, which is really put itself right at the center of the really important reporting work that's going on in trying to address this big problem that we have in science. So I will turn things over to Ivan for formal introductions, but just say thank you very much for coming. Thank you to those of you who are watching online, and I think it's going to be a very stimulating evening. So Ivan, take it away.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks to everyone for being here, both online, here in the flesh, and also listening maybe after tonight at another date. I'm really thrilled to be here and to be able to, and I'll introduce our guests in just a minute, talk about an issue that, of course, I try and think about a lot. Our guests certainly do, and I think a lot of us as science journalists, health journalists, science writers, science communicators, are still coming to terms with it, which is why tonight is going to be such a really exciting and I think eye-opening and provocative discussion. And I do want to emphasize that this is a discussion. So we're going to talk for a little bit amongst ourselves. Doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention. You actually should pay attention, or I think that's why you're here, so please do pay attention. But then we're going to open it up to questions quite quickly because we really want to have a conversation. Speaking of conversations, one of them will happen online. We're delighted about that, of course. And our hashtag, for those of you who are tweeting, whether here or outside in the world, is hashtag Kavli Convo. That's Kavli with a K, Kavliconvo. And I also, in the spirit of conversations, want to just remind everyone that we actually have our next Kavli Conversation 3 weeks from tonight on April 26th. Another really important and extraordinarily timely conversation and subject, which is covering and uncovering sexual harassment in science and in the academy. And again, a terrific evening hosted by our own Rose Eveleth, also BSPN actually, Kate Clancy, and Azine Goriashi, who has done just tremendous, both of them have done tremendous work in this area, coming at it from really different not points of view, but different ways of approaching this issue. But one, of course, as a journalist, Azine, and the other as an academic who does a lot of field work, Kate. And I also, of course, want to thank Lee Holtz, who's here right in the front row. I will only thank him if he says nice things about how this went tonight, but Lee, of course, has run this series and a lot of discussions here and a lot of talks, and certainly been a pleasure for me to be a member of the audience. And so thank you, Lee, for being here and for all the work that you do here. So we're going to talk, as Dan said, about what some people are calling, and this might actually be something we talk about a little tonight about this term, the reproducibility crisis in science. I will say that people, well, they bristle sometimes at the word crisis, and we'll talk about that probably. They also bristle when you say science, because they say, well, not in my field of science. They say, well, it happens, that happens to some other people. And there are a few fields of science that probably have a legitimate, claim or a legitimate case to say it's really just all those other people doing it. But I think if you look at the past several years and what has been happening and what people are thinking about and the studies that have been coming out, some of which one of our guests has, of course, written and published, you see that this affects a lot of fields. In 2012, a study came out showing that basically just about 90% of studies in cancer biology, basic cancer biology, that in one set of studies, about 50 of them, could not be reproduced. They didn't hold up. We're going to talk about what those terms mean. But that sounded the alarm for many people. But as you're going to hear tonight, in fact, the alarm was actually sounded earlier than that, arguably by one of our guests, and maybe even earlier than that, depending on how you're reading the literature. And the question that we have before us tonight, we have a couple big questions, I think, and I'll want to hear others. One big question is, well, what does this all mean? What do scientists do about this? Are there solutions? And we're joined, again, by people who have lots of really good ideas and been doing all the work on that. And the other is, how do we as science journalists and science writers and science communicators think about these issues? These are actually very challenging. I mean, they in many ways, they get to the very core of what it is that we do as science journalists. We are writing about science. We should be writing about evidence. At least those of you who are my students or former students in the room at least have heard me say that. You may not believe it's true, but we actually should be evidence-based in our work. Well, what do we do when we learn that the evidence may be much more porous than we actually thought it was? So, my two guests, and they both have so many accolades that I hope you'll forgive me for actually, having some notes here. Richard Harris, who's to my far left, is of course an NPR correspondent on the science desk, has been with NPR for more than 30 years, has won a tremendous number of awards, including the Peabody in 1988, the American Association of Advancement of Science Award 3 different times. He's traveled to 7 different continents, and in fact was responsible after the BP oil spill in 2010 for showing that actually it was much worse than we thought, and I don't want to get that wrong, but that's sort of more or less, one way to put it, and sparking new investigations into that. So this is important work, it's critical work, and it is questioning work, and perhaps it would be I would be very remiss in not mentioning that his book, and this is, I think, the first, at least the first New York event. That's a safe thing to say.
It's the first event.
First event. And in journalism, we love our firsts.
Yeah.
Often scientists make claims that they came up with something first. They're wrong. We're actually right tonight. So rigor mortis, which is on sale, thanks to our colleague over here at the table. So please do buy it, and Richard will, of course, be signing those for those of you who want that. Rigor mortis: How Sloppy Science Creates Worthless Cures, Crushes Hope, and Wastes Billions. A very subtle sort of title. And someone said about this book that you should read it if you want to see how biomedical research is reviving itself. Oh, I said that, apparently. On the back of the book. So I'm going to leave that here. Sorry, it's blocking John. It should be blocking you. There we are. So please do take a look at that. It really is an excellent book. John Ioannidis, whose name is probably mispronounced even more than mine is, was actually born here in New York, which I think I knew once but had forgotten. Is the C.F. Reinberg Chair in Disease Prevention at Stanford University, and also the co-director, I think even particularly relevant tonight, of the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford. That's Metrics, a wonderful center, and I've had the pleasure of being there at a workshop. They do tremendous work in this area, which I'm sure John will talk about tonight. He has a medical degree as well as a Doctor of Science at DSC from the National University of Athens. And John, again, like Richard, has won a tremendous number of awards, which I will not bore you with. They're all available. But I do have to talk about a few things that John has also done that you may not know about. And that is that he's actually author of 6 literary books in Greek, one of which, for example, is called Toccata for the Girl with the Burnt Face, which I think we may have to talk about tonight because I can't figure out quite what it has to do with reproducibility. And he's actually, if you look at citation rates, actually one of the top-cited scientists in the world, at least in the top 20, maybe even higher than that. But I do want to just sort of underscore that in his own bio, John says, this probably only proves that citation metrics, and we're going to talk about those tonight and why they are so unreliable, are highly unreliable, since I estimate that I've been rejected over 1,000 times in my life. So I'm very glad that John did not reject our invitation to be here tonight and to talk about these important issues. So first, I'd like to just open the conversation by really talking about the problem. You know, I think we've sort of hinted at this problem, and many in the audience are familiar with it, but either of you really, or maybe both of you, you know, when we say that a study, John, you wrote a study, you published a paper in 2005, which is one of the, I think maybe the most downloaded and sort of viewed papers at PLOS Medicine, a big journal, ever, way more than 1 million, I think, at this point, whose title was, you know, Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. Tell us what does false mean? I mean, it's been published, it's been peer-reviewed, someone did the work, they had lab rats or they had people or whatever they had, and then it was peer-reviewed, it was published in one of these journals, and now you're telling us it's false. What does false mean?
It means that it is not true. It means that you have
My questions are always
that
so,
you found a drug that works, that you found a gene that regulates the risk of some disease, that you have found some nutrient that will make you avoid death or cardiovascular disease, that you have found some signature of some fancy molecular properties that can tell you something about your risk of getting something. But actually, it's all noise. It's nothing. There's nothing there. Nothing to celebrate and nothing to worry about as well. So this is not fraud. There's a little bit of fraud, but I think this is probably the exception. This is just the dynamics of science, the way that we do science, which is very difficult. And very often, we're doing that with very small studies, with limited resources, with lots of biases that we're trying to tackle and take care of, but it's very difficult to take care of all of them. And sometimes with some superimposed problems like conflicts of interest, someone just trying to fool oneself. I'm always trying to fool myself, probably, when I do research, and I'm struggling to wake up and say, come on, try to do it better, try to be more objective, try to be less human, but at the same time human, unavoidably, try to make these inferences objectively. So if you put all of these forces together, in most settings, in most scientific fields, when you have a first discovery being made, it's more likely to be false rather than represent something that is genuine. This doesn't mean that the final answer will be false. We have room to correct it. We have room to go back, test whether we did things right, repeat our experiments, try to replicate, and hopefully science is self-correcting, but sometimes this can take quite some time.
So your paper, again, about 12 years old now, said that most published research findings are false. Richard, you've just spent, I don't know how many years, but a number of years thinking about this problem and looking at how big, small, otherwise it is. Do you agree that it's most? Can you put some figures on this for us in particular fields?
Figures are not really available. There are, I mean, John's paper is fabulous, but it's also it's a think piece. It's not based on actual data where he collected a huge number of studies and decided whether they were true or false. It was more an argument of methodology, which is a solid grounding. But if you then try to go out and say, okay, look at papers out there, how many are true, what percentage are true, what percentage are false, people have done very little of that. You mentioned at the beginning this drug company study that was looking at 56 or 53 seemingly really exciting papers, and only 6 of them could be reproduced by the scientists themselves. I mean, that's a startling statistic, but that's still 56 papers, and there's something like 800,000 or 1 million published every year. So this is hardly a representative sample in and of itself. So it's really, it's very difficult to get to that. But from the standpoint of a journalist, the one paper that really caught my attention was published just a couple of weeks ago in PLOS One, where some scientists in Bordeaux who went back to look at a bunch of basically newspaper articles that covered major findings in science and said, how many of these turned out to be true? And they started with 1,500 or something like that, and they whittled it down to 56 papers that had actually been around long enough that there'd been multiple studies, there'd been meta-analyses and so on, and there was some growing consensus in the scientific community about whether this initial finding was true or not. And of these findings, half of them didn't stand up. Half of the things that we reported back in the day turned out to be untrue. And if you look at the papers that were that first exciting finding that everybody's excited about, 2/3 of those were wrong. So caveat writer, right? I mean, this is a tough problem, but that a lot of different angles, a lot of ways of looking at it, I sort of do converge on, again, all small samples, nothing very satisfying, but from many different standpoints, it does seem like about half of the stuff that gets published doesn't seem to be true if you wait a little while.
So, that's one example, and if I'm remembering right, it was either that no reporter went back to actually write about the attempt to replicate, and we're going to talk about that word in a second. That, to me, almost was even more alarming than I do, because I do remember that paper, which I think I wrote about.
I think you did too.
And I think,
the reality is that these big flashy findings are published in Science, Nature, and Cell, and the journals that we are all looking to find these big studies. But when somebody then comes along and says this isn't true, it's not going to be published in Science and Nature and Cell and all the papers, all the journals that we read. It gets published in the journals that are very serious journals, that specialty in the field, and people trust them and all the rest of that. But they do not come across our radar. So some of those papers were, in fact, some of the follow-ups did actually get reported, but the vast majority did not. So the lesson might be, write down all the stories you've done, and maybe after a couple of years, go back and check up on them and do a quick literature search, see if they're still true or not. But of course, it's more boring to say, oh, you remember that great gene for Alzheimer's? Never mind.
All right. So, and maybe just to stay on that for a second, John, if you had a magic wand and could tell journalists, you should do this or you shouldn't do that, and I'm not giving you one, even though you're at a journalism institute, and even if we had one, we would doubt that you had that power. That's what we're supposed to do. What would you say to them about covering studies? I mean, leaving your own studies, which we all should be covering, aside for the moment, what would you say to science journalists about covering studies? I hear in my class, and my students all know, we learn how to, we learn together how to write about a single study, because I think there's a lot to learn about how a study is constructed. But how do you feel about that?
I think that the most essential component in communicating the results of a study is to give a sense of how likely is that to be true. Are we talking about something that has very high certainty, like tobacco is causing lung cancer and is killing people? It's going to kill 1 billion people in the next century unless we do something. Now, we know that very well. We have very strong evidence. The effect sizes, as we call them in statistical terminology, are very strong, and that translates to lots of people dying. So when you communicate that, you can say, this is certain. It's as close to 100% as it can be. Or we know that MMR vaccination is a good idea, and you shouldn't worry about autism. Again, you can have a seal of authority. Even though science is not about authority, you can say, we know that very well. So you can communicate that with a high level of certainty. At the same time, I think you should try to have the right level of uncertainty when there are other discoveries or claims being made that are far more uncertain. So there are some fields that by default are working at levels of very low certainty. There's nothing wrong about that. As I said, science is very difficult. Some fields, the best that they can do with the first pass is like a 1% chance of being correct. And you need the second pass and the third pass to start getting to higher levels. So sometimes this needs to be communicated even to a general public for various reasons. Just general curiosity. Why should people hear about all the weird things? They should hear about science. That's great. Or sometimes there may be also public implications about policy and what to do with your life. And it's good to know that this is a 1% chance of being correct, but better be apprehensive and try to see what will happen. Maybe wait for the next study or be careful, because that's something very important and it could translate to a potential huge impact for public level. I think that that uncertainty is missing. So when you read a news story, you cannot differentiate, is that broccoli causing cancer, which has very low probability, or tobacco causing cancer, which we know for sure. That's something that I think needs to be more properly communicated.
Since you mentioned broccoli, I'm going to stick on this for a second. I like broccoli. I have no problem with broccoli. You did a study. You did a study that I laughed at when I saw first. No, I don't mean I laughed at the study. I just laughed because it was such a smart, funny idea. And I'm going to let you tell it, but I'm just going to call it the Cookbook Study. And the Cookbook Cancer Study, the Cancer Cookbook Story, that probably wouldn't sell very well. Tell us about that, because it does get to some of these issues.
That was a study that we published a few years ago. I worked on it with Jonathan Schenfeld from Harvard. What we did is a cookbook review. So we went to the Boston Cookbook that has been out there since the 19th century. We got one of the new editions. And we randomly selected pages and recipes and ingredients from these recipes. So we had 50 ingredients from that cookbook. And then we went to the scientific literature and we tried to find the 10 most recent studies about potential association of that ingredient with cancer risk. So for 40 of the 50, we found studies that claimed that there was an increased or decreased risk. And actually for the other 10, it was mostly an issue of how we searched because, for example, we searched for the name of the ingredient like vanilla, and we didn't find something for vanilla, but if we had searched for vanillin, which is the biochemical ingredient, then we would have found studies. So for almost all ingredients, with very few exceptions, there were studies suggesting increased risk and decreased risk. And the effect sizes, how big is the risk, were all over the place. Most of the effect sizes were impossible to be true just based on pure logic. If you see a risk ratio of 4 per 1 serving per day, it means that if you eat one more serving of whatever that is, cancer will decrease 4-fold in the community. So with 2 servings per day, it decreases 16-fold. 95% of cancer goes away with 2 serving of
what should we be
X.
doing?
Is that broccoli?
So
or
I bet there must have been broccoli studies as well. So this is against the face of logic. And I'm not saying that nutrition is not important. Nutrition is important. And I think that we have some good evidence that fruits and vegetables are good for you. But for cancer risk, the estimate for 1 serving per day is something like 0.99, if not 0.995 or 0.998, which means if with 1 serving we can decrease cancer risk by 1% or perhaps even by just 2 in 1,000, something of that sort. It's great. It's healthy, and if you extrapolate it to billions of people, that could be very useful. But when you're trying to pursue such tiny risks with studies that have even a little bit of noise, you know that it's far more likely to get it wrong than to get it right. And it's not just nutritional epidemiology. We have many other fields that have operated in the same manner and have published tens of thousands of studies. And retrospectively, we know very well that we were wrong. To give you one example, genetics. Until 10 years ago, we were doing genetic research to find genes that associate with specific diseases in the very same that we continue to do nutrition studies. We would think very hard because of what we knew about biology and metabolism and what genes do, much as we think about what nutrients do. And we would pick our fancy gene and then try to study variation in that gene against a disease and say, well, it increases or decreases the risk of the disease. That's the way we were doing science. This is the way that we do science in most scientific fields. We try to cherry pick our hypothesis and we do our best. We put a lot of thought on that. Now, what happened in genetics is that the cost of running genetic studies went down 100 million-fold. So now instead of testing one gene and one variant, we could test the whole genome. And we could do that very easily. And we could genotype thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people very easily, instead of running these small studies that are what are happening across the board in science. So with very large studies, with very careful genotyping, very accurate measurement of the genome, large consortia, very strong statistics, we could go back and see what were these 30,000 studies saying that we thought that we had discovered genes until 10 years ago. 98.8% of them were not validated. So the failure rate was 99%. And this is the mode that many scientific fields continue to function because the cost has not gone down 100 million-fold in most scientific fields, unfortunately. And the measurements have not improved in the same way that genetics have improved.
So that gets us to thinking about causes a little bit, right? So, and I would be making a grave error if I confused, correlation with causation on, with my two guests tonight. But Richard, in reporting on these issues and reporting for the book and gathering, what evidence there is, what's responsible for this? John said, this is not fraud. Obviously, I'm particularly interested in fraud myself, but even I would say it's a very vanishingly small percentage, maybe a little bit bigger than we think, but not most of it. What's responsible for this, or what are the factors that seem to be at play?
Yeah, well, I think they're numerous. It depends sort of what level you look at. But I think one has already been mentioned, which is that it is really easy to fool yourself. And once you have an idea that you like, you start to see the world through that lens. And I think that and the data is like, oh, this supports my idea, this does. And people, it's human nature. We all do this in our lives, and scientists do it too in their science. It's like this becomes a sort of a lens through which they see the world, and it can lead them astray. But I think there are actually deeper problems in the culture of science, and I think some of those really can be laid at the feet of the fact that the funding has been so topsy-turvy in science, particularly for the last couple of decades. Funding doubled for biomedical research, NIH budget, between 1998 and 2003. The amount of lab space in the country increased by 50%. Scientists were hired like crazy. It was the golden age of science. And then starting in 2003, Congress said, okay, we've solved health, and we'll keep funding at a level rate so all those people can go have fun, but don't expect any more money. And level rate actually meant a 20% decrease in funding once you take into account inflation factor. I love this obscure term called the bird pie, which is the biomedical research and development price index, bird pie, and which is devised by the U.S. Commerce Department and NIH, I guess. So at any rate, so you have all of this huge new science enterprise, and the amount of money available gets smaller and smaller, and the result is that it gets much more competitive. And in the meantime, states are withdrawing money to support science, so these NIH grants loom even larger. And all of a sudden, it's do or die to get a grant, which means it's do or die to publish exciting papers, and it's do or die to, even to get it into promotions and so on. And so this creates terrible incentives in science. It basically, you can choose: do I do the best science, or do I do something that will keep my career going? And nobody should work under those circumstances, but increasingly that's been what's happening in biomedical research. So that's my big picture view. But and then the consequences of that are sort of dominoes that we can talk about as the evening progresses. But that, I think, a lot of it stems from that.
So, and I have a few more questions that I definitely want to hear from, but I just want to remind everyone to please gather your questions. There's a mic over here, so please, if you have some burning questions now, just feel free to step up there, and I will see you in due course, because I'm looking that way. Anyone who has questions on Twitter or et cetera, can please send those. Again, the hashtag Kavli Convo. Richard, what you just said, and I'd like to hear both of you sort of respond to this, touches on a nerve, if you will, a particularly timely nerve. Can you have a timely nerve? My students know that the only metaphors that ever work for me, and even that's questionable, are baseball. So unless it has to do with that, I have no idea. But it is a timely issue, of course, and it's a controversial one, and one that I think a lot of scientists are very concerned about, which is that things have been bad for some time. In other words, we have not seen an increase in NIH funding, and NSF, same thing. And yet now we have an administration that in the 2018 budget is basically threatening or proposing, I think it's a 19%, 20% decrease in funding for NIH, which we could all talk a lot about. But that raises a particular issue for those of us thinking about this issue, and I know that this came up recently at a meeting or after a meeting at the National Academy of Sciences, which is, well, wait, now we're all sort of having this awakening, about the issues in science, about reproducibility, about replication and failure and what have you. This is a particularly bad time to be talking about that. I'm not saying that. I'm sort of just sort of being the mouthpiece of people who say that.
Right.
How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that this is a major issue, and I believe that the way that we see science and the scientific method should not depend on politics. Science is the best thing that has happened to human beings, and I think that funding for science is the best investment that a society can make to aim towards progress. I think this should be a standard message, regardless of politics, regardless of who is in power, regardless of who is saying what about increasing or decreasing the budget for science. Now, at the same time, if we try to defend science and we say, oh, yeah, give more money to science, and we use anti-science arguments to do that, I think that we're becoming worse than those who propose to just throw science away. So if we say you need to fund science because every single grant is going to yield something wonderful, this is highly false. I mean, under the best circumstances, if we're really doing out-of-the-box, innovative, creative research, the failure rate is going to be very high. And cumulatively, if we find 100 people, 100 very bright people, we should be happy if one of them gets something that really is a tremendous contribution to progress and to health and to well-being. And it is worth it. But 99 of the 100 will be a loss. If we say that you need to give funding to science because we are curing Alzheimer's disease, wait a second. We haven't cured Alzheimer's disease, and we have no treatment for Alzheimer's disease. And yes, we have spent a lot of money on that, but this doesn't mean that we should just abandon, because there's no way to cure Alzheimer's disease with politics, with religion, with sports, with sunbathing. We need science if we ever going to get some answer, and it's difficult. So what I worry is that there's a lot of pressure for scientists to show off in the current environment. And we feel under threat. Oh, they're trying to cut our funds. We are under such fierce competition. It's so difficult to get things done, and now I need to prove, and again, prove even more, and have a 5% acceptance rate, and I can only run this tiny study, and I get it wrong, and now I need to say that I'm doing everything perfect. We have to dissociate these two messages. Science is very noble. It's very difficult. We cannot promise what we cannot deliver, and we should not promise what we cannot deliver. We should fight to present science for what it is, which, as I said, is the best thing that has happened to humans. And part of that is because science can be wrong at times. Nothing else can be wrong and then correct the error. I think it's the only way that we can correct our errors.
And when I started out to write this book, I thought that a lot of doors would slam into my face, and I was pleasantly surprised that was not the case. And this tone really started from the top in some ways. Francis Collins, who's, for at least for the moment, director of the National Institutes of Health, when he learned about this, he had two choices. He could have sort of tried to sweep it under the rug, or he could just say, look, we got a problem, we got to deal with it. And he took the second route, and I think that was the right thing to do. It's, politics changes the national conversation, and he had no more idea than I did when I wrote this book how things would shake out. But I think my job as a journalist is to seek the truth and tell the truth, and to ask hard questions. It's like, we're taxpayers too. Is that money being put to the best possible use? And if not, what are some things that we could do to make it better? I don't perceive, it's really hard to predict what's going to happen in Washington right now, because a lot of the conversation, a lot of the decisions are not made in the usual sort of deliberative, let's weigh all the facts and decide what to do. There are a lot of decisions that are being made on a much higher plane than that. And so so I make no predictions about what's going to happen to the NIH budget or whatever, but I do think that many Congress people recognize that this is the source of information that ultimately leads to advances in medicine. And if you cut it off, then everybody who has a relative or has experienced a disease, with Alzheimer's or cancer or heart disease or whatever, it doesn't help to cut off the money. In fact, I think there's a very strong argument in this book that the more you shrink the money pool, the worse the pressures get, and it could actually be counterproductive.
Good. Dan, looks like. There's a question?
Right, so we have our first audience question, which was sent to me by Twitter DM, so cool. Earlier, you guys alluded that there are certain fields that have very low rates of accuracy on a first paper on a new finding. As journalists, are there certain fields that we should be more skeptical of or careful about when we're reporting? Basically, which fields should we be on the lookout for?
Well, I think that we've seen, we talk about biomedical research. I think nutritional studies in particular tend to be dicey. I think we've also seen some very compelling research out of the examination of psychology studies. Brian Nosek and organized a whole bunch of people to go back and look at 100 top psychology papers and see how many of those could be replicated, and the number was fairly small, depending upon how you define replication. But I think those psychology papers, based on, let's get 12 undergraduates into a room and see, run some experiment and then extrapolate to the experience of human beings around the planet, I think those are always studies that one should think twice about taking at face value. I'm sure you have your favorites too.
Well, I think that I wouldn't say that there's good disciplines and bad disciplines necessarily. I think that there can be highly reliable studies within a discipline and others that are very unreliable. So I would probably take a step back and say, can I ask a few basic questions like, is the study small or large? Is the study well controlled? Is it an experimental design with rigorous control, or is it something that is just an observation? How good is the quality of the measurements? Is it something that is easy to measure, that I have accuracy to the third decimal point, or is it something that I'm asking people, how do you feel about your life? And, or I'm asking them, what did you eat 20 years ago? So there are these standard elements that you can ask regardless of whether it's physics or nutrition or sociology. And then there's a second layer, which is who is doing this and why are they doing this? Are there any obvious conflicts of interest? Does someone have to gain out of some particular result? Are we talking about billions of dollars for some blockbuster drug that may be marketed if that result is as it is? Are there any other studies? Is this the first study ever done? Or is it the 10 times before we have seen the same phenomenon and this is like an extra verification? This is also very important. Now, disciplines have their own standards for all of these aspects. So psychology, for example, tends to run relatively small studies, which is not good. At the same time, they have an experimental tradition, which makes them better than other fields. They don't have financial conflicts of interest, which is better than other fields. Sometimes they have intellectual conflicts of interest. So, a famous professor made his or her career with some weird psychological theory, needs to be defended at all costs. So you need to balance each discipline for what it stands for, how it runs its business, and each particular study also what it stands for and how it has gone around doing its business.
As a bench scientist for more than 30 years, funded by the NIH, I have certain perspectives on this. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the journal, so I deal with many aspects of this. In general, women tend to study the question and study it in detail. And men are much more likely to have an observation and run to publish it, maybe without much background. I've seen a lot of arrogance in some men, Nobel Prize laureate among them. So I do pathogenesis studies, and I will do replicates, so 4 individuals for certain kinds of things, 10 individuals, over the course of time, repeat it at least 3 times so that I have assurance that the observations I'm making hold true for this question under these conditions. Nobel laureate came out with 3 knockout animals. At one time point, the knockout animals had many different ages and both sexes, and this didn't hold the test of time. I've done work over many years, and I went from the dark ages where we were using black boxes. You did something, you didn't know what the genes were, you didn't have pure reagents, you didn't have recombinant inbred animals, and now our reagents are so much better and we can tell, what exactly is working in our systems. But there were studies that were done with transgenic mice. So every single mouse was identical, having the same receptor for something. And it was a study looking at, in one case, type 1 diabetes, in the other case, a model of MS. And when these animals were housed in dirty colonies, then you had one observation. In immaculate colonies, you had another. And we didn't understand until we began to understand the microbiome and its contribution to the whole host's immunology.
Yeah.
And so these are some reasons why experiments may come out with very different responses,
Right.
although it's the same experiment.
Yeah, and I actually write a fair amount about mice in my book, and that problem or the issue that I think that there's one school of thought that the mice actually, that it's a mistake to try to make every experiment as absolutely uniform as possible. I actually talked to Joe Garner on the Stanford campus, who believes that basically we should look at mouse studies much more like we do human studies. He says, imagine having a study where you study 43 identical men of the identical age, give them the identical diet, give them set the thermostat to exactly the same temperature, which is, by the way, too cold, and basically make the experiment totally uniform. He actually did an experiment with some friends or colleagues around Europe, and they ran the identical experiment in 6 different places and got completely different results. He says, don't do it that way. Mix it up the way we do with human beings. Embrace the variation instead of trying to pretend it doesn't exist or try to squeeze it out of the enterprise. So I think there are things you can do, and in terms of the mice that are grown in these very sterile environments, their immune systems aren't developed because they're never challenged with anything. And so a huge number of studies based on mice in these sterile conditions, we should not be surprised that they have no relevance for human health.
Well, and just to, sort of respond to something you started with, which about the maybe potential differences between genders and sexes and how they practice science or what their patterns are. And again, I want to be careful here because this was definitely a correlational study rather than a sort of randomized controlled trial with all of that experimental design. And it is also only about retractions, which again is my particular issue, but it's small, but it may say something. So we have two things. One, we have a leaderboard at Retraction Watch of the people who had the most retractions, right? So it's my sports thing again, and we go down to 30 fairly arbitrarily, but we have 30 people on the list. Do you know how many are women on that list of 30? 1. Okay. She's, by the way, kind of perilously close to the bottom. So I suspect at some point there will be no women on the list, which pains me greatly because I actually would like to see women do well in science, and here's a leaderboard. Why can't they do it? But actually, and then it's sort of a funky little bit of data, except that someone, a couple of people did a study. They looked at retractions for fraud and found that men were 9 times more likely to retract for fraud than women were, which is sort of consistent globally, right? With 1 in 30, more, not exactly even. You actually expect more women are sort of within the range. So there may be something there. And even actually going back to the mice, women and men, the mice, because we didn't used to use, female mice for a long time, you'd have that problem. But also because, and we didn't realize this, I'm sure you're aware of this, but men coming into the lab and women coming into the lab created different, fear and stress responses. And so again, we have something that we weren't even looking at, which I don't want to say could explain some reproducibility problems or replication problems, but you kind of can't.
So here we may have a scientific debate. We've looked at differences between men and women across 22 scientific fields, about 50,000 studies and 3,000 topics in a paper that we published in PNAS about 10 days ago with Dan Fanelli and Rodrigo Costas. And there was no consistent, strong signal for differential biases in men versus women. Now, I'm not saying that this is the last word, so please don't write a story. Men and women are exactly the same. I may well be wrong. But talking about mice and men, mice clearly are highly relevant to research. And I think that there's a lot of anti-science attacks that are trying to say, why are we killing all these animals and doing research? This is completely misplaced. I mean, we need this research because otherwise all these weird thoughts that have a 1% chance of success will be hitting me and you instead of hitting these poor mice. So I'd rather test things in mice first. However, they're very relevant. They can be very helpful in giving us insights on what to do next. But we have extensive evidence that a large section of that research has some problems that are so easy to fix, and nevertheless we don't fix them. For example, performing comparisons. For humans, it's not easy to randomize. You need to make some extra effort. And humans, they may decide that what they were randomized to they don't like, and they may say goodbye, or I want to even take the other medication to the one that I was randomized. But mice don't have that option. So randomization costs nothing. It's easy to do. It protects from a zillion biases. How often do we do it? About 10 to 20% of the time. Or blinding investigators who read the results in mice experiments. It's easy to do. It costs nothing. Again, it saves us from lots of trouble, because otherwise you have that classic experimenter bias. You tend to see, oh, this mouse is moving faster and it got this chemical, so therefore this is going to help motivate people. Let me give it for depression. And it's not. It's just experimenter bias. And how many studies do that? Again, about 10% of animal studies use blinding of the investigator. So these are easy targets, things that we can fix with no money. Actually, they would save us a lot of money, because we would be able to do fewer experiments and get even better results. If we don't do that, what do we end up with? We end up with a literature of animal models for stroke. There's more than 1,000 papers, probably several thousands papers. Most of those have found effective treatments for stroke in animal models for stroke. How many effective treatments for stroke do we have for humans? If I have a stroke right now, do I stand a chance? Well, natural history, mostly. If I survive, I survive. There's one treatment which you have to rush me very quickly to the hospital because you have to give it right away. So out of 1,000 proposed things that work in mice, only one works in humans. And it's not that mice are so different. They are different, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is the biases that we have not controlled in that literature.
Please don't have a stroke right now. I don't actually have a medical license.
Yeah, and as a medical student, I thank you for not asking me what that one agent is, because I was like this close to Pavlovian conditioned of getting pimped on that question. But so we spent a lot of time talking about when studies are false. My question is, when studies are true, but they don't work, which gets to the essence of efficacy versus effectiveness, and to what everyone has been talking about in terms of relevance. I mean, a colleague of yours collectively at Stanford, whose name is Paul Wise, has written, the problem with science is not rigor, but relevance. Can you speak a little bit about efficacy versus effectiveness, and how journalists can parse between the two when a study comes out in the New England Journal?
So you're talking about the fact that this drug is statistically significant. It has a statistically significant effect, but it may not really matter. I mean, so many of these new highly expensive cancer treatment drugs may only add a month of life. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. So I think that and as a journalist, I find that it is challenging because scientists often cast those papers in the literature as looking at the percent increase or decrease or whatever. This drug is 6% better than that drug, or 20% better, or even 50% better. But if it's going from 1% to 2% effectiveness, that's the number that my listeners really need to know, not that there's a percentage change. So sometimes sometimes you have to dig into actually the supplemental tables to find out what the real numbers are, because the scientists, all they want to do is talk about how good their result is, how big the effect is, but they use numbers quite often that actually mask it. So I always say, I try not to talk about the percent difference. I try to say this helped 40% here versus 30% there, and so people can get or even better yet, put real numbers on it. There were 30 people in this group did better and 40 people in that group did better. But it's a challenge, because it's not, and it sometimes requires a little bit of arm twisting when you're talking to the scientists to get them to really lay it out, because they're excited. They want to make their results seem as big as possible, and we need to resist that. I mean, there's so many. There's a little literature about that's been looking at all of these exaggerated expectations that we now have around particularly new cancer treatments. The National Cancer Institute and the American Cancer Society last week came out with this annual report about cancer and looking at all the cancer trends and so on. There's a tiny line in that paper which I thought was the most relevant, which is that that despite all of these new treatments that are coming out, a couple dozen a year, whatever it is, there is on the national cancer trends, even if you're looking at specific cancer types, you cannot see the effect of those new drugs in mortality. And that says a lot. It reminds us that we shouldn't be too overly enthusiastic about these new drugs, but that, and that we should think really carefully about how we cast these studies when we report on them.
I think this is a major problem, because especially when it comes to clinical research, and clinical research should be useful. I mean, this is why we're doing it, to help people live longer and better lives. Most of the studies are not using outcomes that patients would care about, and that would really matter. So it's what we call surrogate endpoints, and very often even their surrogacy has not been proved. So we don't even know whether they work as surrogates. This means that whenever you see a new study, you need to ask, okay, so it did improve some outcome, but what was that outcome? Is it something like a blood test measurement? And if so, who cares? Or is it life and death? Is it a serious disease that was avoided or prevented or diminished? And the large majority of studies are not looking at serious outcomes. They're not looking at patient-relevant outcomes. They're not looking at things that do matter. Now, sometimes we do research with outcomes that do matter, but we still have a problem in translating that to things that work in the community in real life, because the intervention may be too difficult to give. It may require some level of expertise, or there may be other hurdles to try to make it happen. One of the best moments in my life was when I was at NIH, at the time when we were running these studies, that we found that there was very effective treatment for HIV. I participated in ACTG 320, for example. That was the randomized trial that showed that if you give 3 drugs, including a protease inhibitor, versus 2 drugs, you can drastically affect the mortality risk in these people. We could see in front of our eyes a disease being transformed from a killer, unavoidable, people die, there's nothing else you can do, to something that was a chronic condition that people could live pretty much normal lives. So great success, one of the greatest success that I can imagine. However, we're talking 20 years later, or more than 20 years later, and there's 35 million people who suffer from HIV, and most of those around the world, they don't have access to treatment, or they cannot take the treatment long enough, and many of them will still die because they're not given something that we know works. So there are some hurdles that we need to move across, and I have very often argued that when we have found something that has been validated and we know that it works, it's important to not forget to invest on making it happen, rather than just try to make more discoveries. Claiming that people are dying because we haven't discovered something, when people are dying because we have found something and we're just not implementing it, it sounds very silly to me.
Thank you.
Right, so we have another question on Twitter, which I just lost. I'm sorry. Okay. So, would it help if journalists ask scientists, as a condition of covering their research, to see the peer reviews that they received?
I guess that's a very tricky question on a number of planes. Because I don't know. Do scientists always see their peer reviews, or
Well,
In
the
public?
authors do.
what?
The authors do,
Yeah.
and some journals allow peer reviews to be in public view. So, for example, the BMC journals have the full sequence of what the reviews were and what the responses were and what amendments were made to the paper. I think it's not a bad idea. Peer review does help, but if you expect that peer review will solve all the problems, or that if all the peer reviews were available, then everything would be fine. I mean, this is entirely unrealistic. There's empirical studies that have looked at how much improvement there is after peer review, and at least in the BMC journals, about 25% of papers become better, about 5% of papers become worse, and about 70% of papers remain the same. And we've looked at BMJ, which is kind of a higher impact journal, and we see pretty much the same picture there. So think about it. Peer review is done practically voluntarily. You know, you have a couple of busy scientists who are trying to do a zillion things and write grants to get money because the budget is shrinking. And now they get these invitations. I get probably over 1,000 invitations to peer review papers every year. And I need to find time to do that. How much time am I going to find? I'm an experienced reviewer. I can read the paper very fast and find the errors right away. Really? I mean, sometimes I get papers that I have no clue what they're talking about. I would need to spend 2 months to get oriented to the basics before I start really looking at that. So I can say, thank you, I cannot review, or I can be a good Samaritan and try to review, but how much am I going to
Or you
improve
could
the
farm it
paper?
off to a graduate student. If you
Or
have
I
it.
can give it to someone
Which
who
happens-
knows less than...
I was waiting.
Which happens
I was waiting
a lot.
for someone to say
Right,
that.
yeah.
So peer review is useful, but lots of glaring errors, lots of major problems will just fly through. And if you look at most of the peer reviews that are available in public, they say very little. You know,
Well,
they say,
Richard,
what a great paper, what a bad paper.
Yeah.
Why don't you change this comma here? This is not well phrased. I fully disagree. This has been, and then a tirade of
Well, I
4
think,
pages
though-
with no data.
But I think for my purposes that I would not don't think I would find them particularly useful, because for one thing, you discover as you're reporting things that every field has politics, right? And if you've got the anonymous peer reviews, you don't really know, maybe this is one of the big political enemies of this person, and there could be other motivations. I like to do my own peer reviewing. I call around other people in the field, find out what's going on, and then I can say, well, are you friendly? Do you throw darts at each other? I mean, basically, you can sort of suss out if there's some really bad blood, if there's a feud or something. Then you weigh that when you listen to the comments of a scientist, and you say, well, geez, if this is just, and maybe the story becomes here's these 2 pugilistic scientists going at it again.
Well, and if you know the field as well as the editor does, and sometimes, with all due respect to editors, you know the field better as a journalist than some of the editors do, then you're probably calling one of the peer reviewers for outside comment.
It happens frequently. Yeah,
so-
people. It's like, I don't need to see the paper. It's like, okay, there's a clue.
Right.
It's like, okay, you've already seen it. So yeah.
Dan?
So for those of us who think a lot about how to make science journalism better and are focused on training science journalists, a lot of what we do is to think hard about risk and benefit and make sure that we understand how can we assess confidence in the result, how confident should we be in the result, and also how high or how low the risk is. And so a lot of what we do in our training is putting risk and benefit in context. So a lot of what we discussed today is really useful in helping us apply that context. But that's not really the core issue that a lot of us, a lot of science journalists, science communicators confront every day. The core issue is more whether we should write it up at all. And that becomes really difficult because it would be easy to say if confidence is low or a risk is low or benefit is low, just blow it off. But as journalists, we're not in the habit of blowing things off. We need to take the social context into account. If our audiences are interested, we're not in the habit of blowing off things that our audiences will read. So the easy part, relatively easy part, is learning to put that into the correct risk context. The hard part is thinking, when should we just not do this at all? So I wonder if you would each address that question. What do we do when a study is bad, but our readers are really, really interested? Of course, we can report accurately that the study is poor, but is the very act of reporting, are we contributing to bad science in some way? And how do we handle that?
Yeah. Wow, that's a complicated question. I've got a couple of ways to cut at it. One of which is to remember also that listeners and readers and viewers bring their own prejudices to something. So even if you say very clearly, here's this finding, but it's just complete nonsense, if a lot of people are predisposed to believing the finding, they'll skip over that part where it says it's complete nonsense. So the idea that you can craft a balanced story and have a balanced impact on your audience is false. And so that adds complications when for example, when you're reporting about vaccines and so on. The more you report about, oh, do vaccines cause autism, even if you're completely dismissive, you're still keeping that story alive, and that may be what you're alluding to a little bit. I actually had a rare experience in the opposite direction, that I decided to go with a study that most people said, I'm not touching this study, and I think I'd be happy to talk to people about it. I'm not 100% sure I made the right decision, but I feel good about it, there was a paper that came out a couple weeks ago that claimed this astonishing improvement in treatment of sepsis, which kills 300,000 people a year. It kills more people in the hospital than anything else. It's the third leading cause of death in the country. And there was a scientist at a small medical school in the U.S. who actually is a well-respected person in his field, who published these results. He studied 47 patients, and he tried this treatment on them, and none of them died of sepsis, when you expect, according to the paper, when you expect a much higher fatality rate from that. 4 people died of other causes, but the sepsis causes were very low. He then went on, he said, I'm convinced this works, and he told me in his video testimonial, et cetera, that basically he's now make this as his regular practice. He's treated 150 patients, and he's had 1 death from sepsis. This is an extraordinary claim. It could easily be wrong, but on the other hand, if it's right, this is a discovery that will change the practice of medicine, and it'll do more than anything else in recent decades to change death rates in this country. And so I made the decision that even though it's like, there were a lot of red flags or potential problems with this, I decided this is something that we should find out the answer to. A lot of times things like this just fester, and people make some extraordinary claim, and a decade can go by before people actually believe it, like the case of discovering that ulcers are caused by bacteria. That discovery was a clean discovery, made in 1982 or whatever, and it took forever for people to say, okay, that's a real thing, and ultimately the guys won the Nobel Prize. But clearly this is a long shot thing to happen. But my decision was, this is an important enough question. It would only take a couple $1 million to do carefully controlled studies and really figure this out. Let's not just, and I got complaints from listeners who said, oh, you should have waited until there was more data on this. And that's true. And I recognize that that's a point of view that many journalists had, because I think very few other journalists covered this, certainly none before I did. But I think that my sense was that here's a question that deserves an answer, and I'm now committed to following through. I've already done one follow-up story about what it would take to put together a clinical trial, who's thinking about doing it, who would fund it, and so on. And my story did create a lot of interest, and it got some major funders interested in funding this immediately, and it's created some movement. It may be a bust, could very well be a bust, but if it's not a bust, it's huge. This was not an easy decision for me to make, because we generally do tend to say, let's wait till we get more data. But I thought this was one. The claim was so extraordinary. The guy was not crazy. He's not a kook. He had some at all. He's a little bit brash, but he's well regarded in the world of the kind of medicine he does. So I said, I'm going to put that out there. I'm going to put it in context, and I'm going to follow it. So we'll see.
So I will try to be unscientifically absolute here, but if you see something that seems extraordinary, it's almost certainly wrong. And I say this because we just have enormous evidence about that statement that I made, that if you take clinical trials, for example, a few years ago, we published a paper in JAMA where we looked at 250,000 clinical trials worth of data, the entire Cochrane database that had been accumulated over 20 years on 85,000 meta-analysis of clinical topics and interventions. So it was like everything about medicine that you could hope to see. How often did we see a clinical trial, a controlled, randomized trial? And the example was even uncontrolled, so it's even a higher level.
He had a comparison group, but it was a retrospective comparison group.
But here I'm talking, prospective,
right,
randomized.
Absolutely, yeah.
How often did we see a 5-fold difference, which is like a big improvement? About 10% of the time. There were trials that had these big effects. On average, they had a sample size of 14 events, so close to nothing. How many of those got validated? If I ask you, out of this immense amount of a 250,000 trials on 85,000 topics, how many times do we have mortality being reduced 5-fold, seen in 2 trials with significant results in both? Just once. So out of thousands of extraordinary, extravagant, extreme effects, one was very solid that it was indeed such a great breakthrough. Now, there are more. I mean, probably nobody tested insulin when it first came around in randomized trials, because at that time we didn't have randomized trials. I'm not even sure whether penicillin was ever tested. And, it probably changed the course of history. But the chances of hitting upon a penicillin or hitting upon insulin versus the denominator of tens of thousands, and if you go beyond randomized trials, we're talking about millions of papers that promise extravagant results, is very tiny. So if you bet your money this is wrong, I mean, you have 99.999% chance of getting it right. Now, if you want to cover it, that's fine. But I think that what I asked up front, that uncertainty label should be there. That, wow, treatment for sepsis, 100,000 studies have failed to date, but this may be the one. But 100,000 studies have failed to date to find something that is very effective in sepsis. So credibility, I don't know, 0.1%, 1%, whatever you want to coin it, worth testing, clearly. I wouldn't say no. Randomized trial, right. We can bet.
Hi.
It's good odds, though. If you win, though, you
oh,
can,
yeah.
No, but I mean that's exactly right. I mean, 'cause, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and he clearly did not have that. And I used that line in my story. But it is also true that I mean, his data were astounding, and if they are right, I mean.
Yeah.
I mean, it would change the world, and you can't. And people said, "Oh, they're bad sepsis studies all the time." And I said, "Send me one," and so, or send me some, and they say, "Oh, look at all these failed trials." But it's like they're, it's nothing that dramatic at the start then gets knocked down. I mean, small effects disappear, but it's hard to find this big an effect in all of those claims. I mean, and there is actually an ongoing randomized controlled trial related to this, not exactly this treatment, but there is other suggestive evidence. But I do take your point that this is a long shot, absolutely, but I think every now and then a long shot is worth betting on.
Hi, I'm a fundraiser, so I'll admit I'm already out of my depth in this whole conversation, but I have tried to raise money for scientists here, and I actually did work on a proposal for a very large foundation that was giving money to solve the problem of replicability. So a few years ago. And you mentioned earlier about standards, the standards that exist in a particular scientific field to replicate. And that was the very thing that these scientists at NYU were trying to get at, which was to establish broad, standards across different scientific sectors so replicability could happen. So I'm confused that are there standards that scientists establish that are published and everybody goes by, or is this a problem that they don't exist? Sorry if my question is a yes or no.
Well, that's
So
yeah, that was-
the yes or no answer is yes. There are standards, and actually there are many standards, and there are some standards that we know work very well. There's others that would be more debated, and there's others that are in evolution. There are standards that are applicable across all science, and there are other standards that may be tailored more to the needs of a particular field. So many of these standards, unfortunately, are failed repeatedly for various reasons, ranging from lack of knowledge, lack of resources, cutting corners, competition, trying to get there fast, trying to get something significant. I mean, if you pose standards, if you pose more standards, more rigorous standards, I mean, you're fighting against yourself. You're diminishing your chances of coming up with something extravagant because you don't allow all these little errors right and left to get in your way to bring that quote-unquote discovery to the forefront. But many scientific societies are aware of many of these problems, and they're adopting these standards. Now, there are standards about how to design studies. There are standards about how to report studies. There are standards about how to analyze studies. There's standards even about reviewing, for example. How many of these standards can we implement? At some point, we may reach a point where there's so many standards to fulfill that there's no time left for science. So each standard needs to have some scientific evidence to support it, that this is a good thing to do, and it's not just a bureaucratic requirement to just check another checklist and, who has time for that? But some of that hopefully will have some positive impact.
Hi, my name is Jessica Siegel, and I teach journalism here, magazine journalism, and I'm actually really asking this as a member of the reading public, because I also write about science, but I'm particularly personally disturbed. I have Alzheimer's in my family by the way the press has been reporting on this with really fantastical promises of results. And then when I look at the studies, and now I'm honestly trying, I really don't want to cover it, they seem to make claims that are not based on thorough enough studies. In other words, they talk about amyloid deposits and that they're less or more, but then they never actually do any kind of intelligence or memory testing on the subjects. Is this a case of journalism run amok? Are the scientists making the claims? Where is this coming from? Or is it just an area where there really are very few concrete results, there's really no treatments, and so that it's sort of rife for this kind of snake oilism? So I'd like to understand it better.
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I think that there are, a drug for Alzheimer's would be a multi-billion-dollar blockbuster. So the companies are understandably very eager to talk about what they're working on and to pump it up. It's a desperate disease, and it's easy for journalists to be tempted to say, this could be it, and reflecting on what I was last talking about. But yeah, I think that there is a temptation to do that. On the other hand, I also think that there's a temptation to say nothing works, nothing's going to work, and so on. I can't remember the name of a veteran medical writer for the Washington Post many years ago who said there are two kinds of medical stories: there's new hope and no hope. And so you take your choice. How you frame your story on Alzheimer's is going to be one of those two. But I think it's important not to raise false hopes. And it's an incredibly complicated area in Alzheimer's. A lot of false leads. A lot of people think, we really do. We think we're homing in on the mechanism, which may or may not be true. And so it's a very gray area, and it's hard to pick bright objects out of that.
I took a quick look at the index in your book, and it looks like Alzheimer's is in there. Do you think it contrasts particularly with other illnesses, or it's just in the realm of no hope, no, I mean, why that one? Why are people so?
Well, I mean, it's a very important disease just economically in this country and personally for us because a significant percentage of people are at risk for Alzheimer's and may develop it if they live long enough in particular. I think one of the scientists I talked to is Greg Petsko, who's up at Weill Cornell here, and he's been studying Alzheimer's for many years. And his view was that one problem with Alzheimer's is you're studying cognition. He says, how do I even measure that? I mean, what is cognition? And so it starts with a very basic problem of definition. How do you study your endpoint? He also thinks that the field has been badly led astray by animal studies because he thinks that people they tried to develop Alzheimer's drugs with mice in particular, and it's been a bust. And he now says he says the field has been led astray, and it's time to recognize that and move on and find some other tools for approaching Alzheimer's disease.
Thank you. Extremely helpful.
And I would just add to that in fact, what you see is every single incentive at every stage of the pathway, whether it's from basic science, and getting grants to then someone with all due respect to, people who write press releases, someone having to write a press release, to a journalist deciding what to cover and how to play that story. Every single incentive is, in my mind anyway, misaligned. It's aligned in the wrong direction. It's like you have these it's like a ball that you flip, you hit all the flips, and it all goes this way, and then we're somehow surprised. And I think that it's true of many diseases, and I think that if you look at a project like Health News Review, they've been reviewing news stories for a long time, and have interesting data and cases of that. But now they're actually reviewing with these what I think are the right criteria, but those should be tested too, press releases, and seeing whether or not those actually reflect what was in the study, what the limitations are, all of that. It's really interesting. It's unfortunately very depressing, I would argue, but it's actually very interesting. So,
I may add to that Alzheimer's disease obviously has attracted a lot of attention because it has a major burden of disease, and there has been some progress. I mean, it's not that we have not learned anything. We have learned a lot about its genetics and its pathology and how it expresses itself and how it evolves, and so there is knowledge, but the truth is that we don't have interventions. We don't have effective interventions that would change the course of the disease in a meaningful way. And here you have that vicious circle that scientists and their institutions and their communications officers, they cannot acknowledge that because there's all that tremendous pressure. You need to deliver, you need to write up your next grant and say, I found all of that and I'm going to find even more. If you say, I failed, because this is going to be the truth for practically all of that research in terms of interventions at least, that will sound very weird. But this is what we need to be able to say without fearing that this is what has happened. We put our best effort, we try that, we failed. Can we please change our route of experimentation? Because otherwise, people continue doing the same things and wasting their time, their resources, their effort, their brilliance, going down the wrong path. And this is an inbuilt problem within the system that we cannot acknowledge failure, and failure is part of science.
All right, so we have another Twitter question, but I'm going to ask mine first. So towards the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that science is, or at least ought to be, self-correcting, and then this term emerged later. When experiments don't find the expected or desired result, they're framed as a failed study. I'm just curious how you guys feel about the role of negative results in reproducibility studies and how we can better distinguish them from actual errors.
So I love negative results, and I have even written that all negative results should be published, while positive results should be published only sparingly. Because if you see a negative result in the current environment, it's very likely to be true. If you see a positive result, as we said, we may debate whether it's 50%, 10, 20, 70, but it's far from 100% on average. So negative results can be very informative. Just the example we were talking about, if you do a very nicely done study and you control for different possibilities and you get a squarely null negative result, then you know that you can move to the next target. You don't need to waste your time, your effort, your resources, the time and the effort of hundreds and thousands of other scientists and other people who are interested in this. Say, here I prove that this does not work. Let's move on. Conversely, a positive result, you need to follow up, replicate, see whether it works, whether it can be implemented, translated, efficacy, effectiveness. I mean, you have a very, very long way. A negative result, that's beautiful. So negative results need to be respected. Their information gain is a word from physics. It's the same as entropy. They can have enormous information gain. So there are some proposals who have been put forth, well, we need to publish negative results, but let's find a separate journal for them. And there are separate journals for negative results, but then you seem to feel that these are second-class citizens in science. The positive results and the negative results, unfortunately. Negative results have an equal footing with positive results. And not only at the end stage, also at the design phase. When we think about a study, we should not think that, oh, it's going to be a highly significant, marvelously p-value less than 0.000 something and I will save the world. That's great, but what if it fails, quote unquote, or what if it's completely negative? Will you gain something out of that? If not, and if the odds are pretty high that this is going to be a null result, then you have to think, is it worthwhile doing that research? So the possibility of any type of result should be taken into consideration even from the very start of thinking about the study.
Yeah, I think.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I could just a word or two more about that, which is that I've talked to many scientists who try to replicate an experiment and they can't, and they go, well, this is a dud. But then they realize if I want to publish this as a negative result, I have to do 10 times as much work to make sure that I didn't screw it up or that it really is negative, and it's a whole lot more work. So a lot of people actually will just give up and move on, and it's not a great trend. But on the other hand, sometimes negative results are because the replicator got it wrong too, and so it's not. There's a bigger threshold than just sort of saying, oh, I didn't find this, I'm going to write it up and move on. It still requires as much effort as a positive result, and scientists are not incentivized to do that. They're incentivized to move on.
I guess I have sort of a bigger picture question in the sense that because there are so many one-off studies and results that can't be reproduced, that also contributes to a decrease in trust in science and decrease in trust in journalism that's covering those results. Is there something that we can do to sort of address that challenge as science communicators?
Great question. Yeah.
Richard?
Me? I thought John was he was warming up on that one.
Okay.
So I have to go back to what I said from the very beginning, that label of certainty and uncertainty. I think that if we are careful about how we present, how we sell, how we market our result, either as scientists or as journalists, then we have a lesser chance of being proven completely wrong downstream. So I think that currently we suffer because we have been proven wrong so obviously so many times. And I think if we were more careful on how we phrase what we have found and what the limitations are and what can we make out of it, I think that these apparent deviations from reality would not be so frequent. At the same time, I always believe that we need to defend science because it can get things wrong, but eventually it can correct them. So there's no point to try to present science as something that is always correct. And, oh, you got it wrong, therefore science is wrong. No, we are wrong all the time, but eventually we do get things straight after a lot of work. So it's a completely different mindset and something that people need to be educated from very early on. What is science about? What is the scientific method about? Why is it so important? Why is it so noble? Why is it so difficult? Why do we need science? Instead of science is like a movie, and the heroes are always the best, and they can always survive no matter what happens. That's not true. Science is very difficult.
And I would be interested to think about whether people really do trust science less or trust journalists less in these contexts. And I think that's an interesting subject for study, and I'm unaware of a literature around that, but I think it's a really interesting question. But I would hesitate to jump to that conclusion, although it's a reasonable one.
Yeah, there are actually some studies that don't come at that head on, but that are starting to look at what actually leads to trust and distrust. And I'll admit my personal bias, which is, the cover-up is always, worse than the crime, which is, I think, getting back to what John was saying, if we keep saying everything is going to be correct and we have the answer, if we look at science as just giving us the answer, as opposed to a process, as opposed to a, half a step this way and half a step that way.
And I think people do judge by the output of what they see. Do they have a cool new telephone that was made possible by technology? Do they have a drug that actually works for them? So I think people much more judge the technology output of science than they do the process of science itself.
Speaking of technology, Dan?
Yeah, so we have another Twitter question. Will open access journals make science's reproducibility crisis better or worse?
Well, open access journals are, I think that means that you can read it without paying for it. I think the broader question is, there's a big conversation around this, and it's also about not even journals, but it's preprints of when a scientist makes a finding, do they even wait to publish it, or do they put it in the preprint literature and let people talk about it before it's even been through peer review? So there are many layers of this. I think the more openness and the more data that are shared in general, the better. I think that there's a guy named Brian Nosek who's at the Center for Open Science in Charlottesville, Virginia, who articulates this point of view very, very well. And I spent a chunk of time with him while I was writing my book about this. But he really says if you make your data available, if you say in advance what hypothesis you're testing, so you can't then screw around and choose a convenient hypothesis after you've looked at your data. If you put your methods out there and say exactly what they are, if you make your computer code widely available so people can actually run the same calculations you did, and if you put all your data out there, that's good because for two reasons, one of which is if you have an astonishing claim or even not astonishing claim, somebody who cares can go in and very quickly see what you did and see if they can replicate it or not. And so that's helpful. The other thing, maybe even more important, is if you know you're going to be that exposed to exactly what you did and how you did it, maybe you'll be a little bit more careful to do that. So I think that in general, openness is one of the solutions or one of the ways to improve the situation in science.
I fully agree. And this can happen at multiple levels. So open access is, let's say, a preliminary level because it's just about reading the paper, which could be just a representation of a much larger universe, which is all the data, the protocols, all the experiments that happen, that may be a millionfold bigger compared to the published paper. So how do we get to that point? I think is the most difficult question because openness sometimes is not free lunch. I mean, you need to have some extra effort to add that openness to make it meaningful. So for example, I can easily toss all my data sets online, but then unless I give you the full code of what I mean and how I have coded the variables and what kind of extra work I have done or have not done, you will not be able to tell what's going on here. So that extra layer of contribution to openness, when, who, how should be done is a point of active debate at the moment.
So I'm very intrigued by the notion of whether excuse me, and whether and how people treat null results and why they aren't as respected as positive results. And the reason for this is my former field was particle physics. And in particle physics, null results are the de facto way of publishing. You do them, people make entire careers out of them. Studies are published in the highest impact factor journals reporting high-quality studies of null results. And so there's this established sociology of a field that respects null results. Now, of course, not to say that particle physicists are better than others. This is externally imposed by the reason that for 20 years there wasn't a single interesting positive result. But I'm wondering if you've looked into this and looked into what happened with the sociology in particle physics to make it the case where these null results are really career builders and career makers. I mean, is it just the thing I made a joke about, or is there maybe more to it or a lesson that could be learned there?
Well, I think you answered your own question. I do think that makes a lot of sense. But I also think that when you look at the converse, which is what happens with null results in biomedical science, if you can get them published, you get them published in a journal that is a low impact factor journal, which doesn't help your career very much, and nobody cites those results, or they're cited very rarely. So that's why no journal wants to touch it, because they want to pump up their impact factor. So science isn't going to take a big negative result that they know no one's going to cite. So it just hurts their bottom line. So may not be true in the physics literature, but it is amply here. So there's lots of institutional reasons why, beyond what we've talked about before, that discourage this practice, and it is unfortunate, but it is part of the landscape that we're dealing with here.
It's basically an issue of rewards, incentives, and expectations. So in biomedicine, the typical paradigm is the principal investigator who gets an R01 for 3 or 4 or 5 years and is told you need to find significant results, positive results, otherwise you will not get any more funding, you will not get promoted, probably you will even not have a job. So that's what he or she needs to do. Now think of applying that same model to particle physics, where instead of funding CERN and 20,000 physicists working on it and mostly coming up with negative results, but finding Higgs boson, something quote-unquote positive, but everything else so far seems to be silent. Instead of that, the same amount of money would be split to these 20,000 physicists, and they would be told, within 3 years you need to come up with a new boson, okay? Because otherwise you're out of your job. What would you get? Probably you would get 20,000 bosons in the literature. And that's why we get 20,000 bosons or probably 20 million bosons in biomedicine.
So, we end now, I think, unfortunately, on 20 million bosons. That'll be the title of Richard's next book. This was a terrific discussion. I just want to thank Richard and John so much for taking the time tonight and for such an engaging and lively conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I just do want to remind everyone that while there is, I can't see from here whether there's still any wine. There may or may not be. I can't detect it from here. Detect it from here. Detect it from here. Detect it from here.